Welcome to Casual Friday. So I have a project update on a work in actual progress, and then I have an update on my next vintage sweater project. And then I'm going to answer a couple of questions that people have left me that I said I would answer in an episode of Casual Friday. So if you'd like to jump right to any specific point in the video, just like in Technique Tuesdays, I always put links down in the description to different points in the video. So the past couple of weeks, I have been working on a pillow for my daughter who just moved to Chicago. I think I showed you the back of the pillow. It's just a slip stitch pattern. The other half is a stitch pattern where you knit below. And I'm looking at this image in the monitor and I feel like there's a mistake somewhere. Maybe it's just I was knitting looser. Something's funky there. I'm going to have to evaluate. I may have to be ripping back. We'll see. It's weird how sometimes you can't see something in person in front of you and then you take a picture of it, or in this case I was showing it up to the camera and it just stood out. So I'm going to have to really take a look and see. I think there's an error in here, so I'll be ripping back. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I am on the lookout for my next vintage sweater project. My plan is to do decade by decade. So to do one sweater from each decade. I've done the 1900s and now I'm into the 1910s. So I really want a pattern from about World War I. And I've been looking, there are a lot of digitized patterns online that you can find. They're not all in one location, and I'm just gradually finding different places that I can seek them out. But the thing about World War I, that era, is that things were pretty plain fashion-wise in terms of sweaters. The lines got much longer, so sweaters are down to the hips. There's no shaping in them of any sort. And they're just really rather plain. And so I want to find something that I actually want to wear and that I think doesn't look out of place in the 21st century. And I really wasn't having any luck. There were patterns that I could knit. I just really wasn't feeling it. And what I mentioned a couple of weeks ago is that there's this YouTube channel I watch called Curiosity Inc. And apparently a number of you also watch it. He's got tons of subscribers, so it's no surprise. But he's an antiques collector. He has a business doing that, but then he also likes projects. And his project that he had for the past few months was that he bought a hoarder house. It was 100 years old, and the owner, who was still alive but in a nursing home, she was over 100 years old. Her kids were trying to figure out what to do with the house. I think she had lived in it 60 or 70 years and she never had thrown anything out. Plus there was things in the attic that had accumulated before that. So rather than trying to find particular things in this house that was crammed full, he knew that there was going to be a lot of stuff. So he just decided to buy the house and then clear it out and upcycle things within the house to use in order to refurbish it and bring it back to what it was. Well, it turned out that the woman who owned the house had been a pretty famous Canadian potter, and there were a number of her pieces that he found in the house, and that's not something he normally deals with. So he decided to use a local auction house where he lives to do an auction of some of those ceramic pieces. So he auctioned off, I don't know, 70, 80 different pieces, and he still had a bunch left. And so a few weeks ago, while he was still in the finishing phases of this house, he was going through a box of stuff that he had found a long time ago, but had just left in the attic. So he was sorting, it was a lot of papers and things like that. So he was sorting through it, and he pulls out these knitting patterns. And what I noticed was that one of them was from 1918. And my immediate thought was, oh, I haven't seen that pattern book. I wonder if that has something in it and I'd be interested in buying it. So I contacted him, asked him, how much do you want for it? I'm interested in buying it. And he didn't hear from him. So I contacted him again and he said, oh, he's going to put them in an auction in mid-June. So over the next few days after that, he had other videos, and he was talking about he was going to auction off the remainder of all of the pottery that he had found. And in addition, there would be a few other items from the home that would be in the auction. Most of it, though, is going to be pottery. So he was showing all the different pieces that were going to be in the auction. And then he showed her the woman's telephone that had been in her house. And he thought, why not? And then he said, well, a lot of you were interested in these knitting patterns, so I'm going to put those in the auction too. And as soon as I heard that, and I thought, oh, there's so many people who have seen those patterns, and if there's that many people interested in them that he's going to put them in the auction, I am not going to want to bid on that because I don't even know what patterns are in that book. So I hadn't found anything I liked yet, and I wasn't going to get into some sort of a bidding contest with somebody online to get this book and then find out there was nothing in it I wanted. And not only was it just the one, there were actually 3 books. And one of them is the 1918, another's from about 1928, give or take a few years, and then the other one is from 1938. I have no interest in the other 2 booklets, only in the one. So I was just like, I'm going to see if I can just find, now that I know the specific name of that booklet, I'm going to see if I can find it online because it's in the public domain. It's not protected by copyright. And a lot of these vintage patterns are available online because they are no longer protected by copyright. They are in the public domain. Anything before about 1923 or 4 in the US is not protected under copyright. After 1924 up into the 1970s, copyright laws changed, and it can really vary whether or not something is still protected or not. But if it's before the early 1920s, it's in the public domain. So I searched for this pattern book, and I found it on Project Gutenberg. Now, I've heard of Project Gutenberg, but I don't think I've ever looked at books on there. And it never occurred to me, because I hadn't remembered about it, it never occurred to me to look for knitting books on there. It has a few, maybe 10 different knitting books. And a lot of them, if you're interested in this, a lot of them, most of them are from the 19th century, so quite a few from the 1860s, and I believe there's even at least one from the 1840s. So we're talking the earliest knitting patterns. And now there's not going to be anything in those books that I'm particularly interested in right now because there aren't going to be any sweater patterns, and that's what I'm interested in knitting for my vintage adventures. Unlike other sites that take these old books and scan them and then present them as PDFs, so you see the original page as it was presented, but in basically image form, Project Gutenberg scans the photos, the images that appear on a given page, but the text is run through OCR, which is optical character recognition, so that you aren't seeing the image of the text, you're seeing the actual text. The advantage to that is that makes books searchable. It also means you can copy text and paste it into documents, that sort of thing. So that was interesting, but I was wishing that I could see the actual image of the page, but I was happy that I could at least see what was in the booklet to know if, well, maybe I would want to bid on that booklet. So I'm flipping through it, and I did find a sweater that I liked. And the name of the sweater I found very amusing. Again, that period of time, most items were just labeled as what they were. Child's bonnet, a woman's shawl, that sort of thing. So sweaters were ladies sweater, you turn the page, ladies sweater, turn the page, ladies sweater, turn the page, man's sweater. I mean, that's how they named things. So I was flipping through and I find the sweater that I want, and and the name of it is not a lady's sweater. It's serviceable sweater, which is so me. I'm very, very practical. But I just thought that was very funny, like that's the selling point of this sweater, is that it's serviceable. So I liked it. Now, I don't just want to find something that I'm willing to wear.
I want to find something where I'm going to learn something during the process of making it. So I'm really interested in the construction process for the sweaters that I'm looking at. I'm interested in the kinds of techniques that were used because, like I say in my technique videos, there's always multiple ways of getting to the same endpoint. So I'm really interested to see how these old sweaters, like what their default method might be for particular types of techniques, and then to see just to see how techniques are used. Like, how are they using decreases? How are they using increases? Where are they placing them? Is there any information that would inform me about how things would have been seamed back then? Because from what I can tell, reading these instructions, I don't think they were using mattress stitch. So that's the kind of thing I'm interested in looking for. It's things that we take for granted now, like this is the proper way to do something, or this is the best practice for attempting to do this type of thing. What were they doing back then? That's the kind of thing I'm interested in. So this particular sweater, at that time, many sweaters were still being constructed in the way that the Edwardian sweater I knit recently was knit, which is starting at the bottom of the back, knitting up to the shoulders, no shoulder shaping, coming over the shoulders and down to the fronts. If things were knit completely in pieces, it had to do with the stitch pattern. Like, it wasn't a stitch pattern that would look the same coming this way and that way. But these designs tended to be plain. The Edwardian sweater I knit that had this zigzag stitch pattern looked the same upside down and right side up. Another sweater I saw in the Edwardian era had cables. Cables will look the same right side up or upside down. That also means that you can knit the sleeve. If the stitch pattern looks the same right side up or upside down, you can start the sleeves. Even though you're knitting them separately, start them at the sleeve cap and work toward the cuff, which allows you to alter the length later if it's not right, or to rip the cuffs out and reknit them if they get frayed. So there's some real advantages to some of the construction sort of defaults that they were using. But one of the things I also noticed was a reason for knitting pieces completely separately, the back separate from the front, was if there was shoulder shaping, because that wasn't really something I saw in the 1910s, and it's not seen very often so far in the 1910s, but it is seen sometimes. So I was looking at this pattern and I saw the back was knit separately from the front, and I wondered why. And I looked at the instructions, and it's that the back has shoulder shaping. And not only does it have shoulder shaping, that shoulder shaping is done with short rows. So that's another thing I'm interested in, is how they were using short rows at different periods of time. So in the Edwardian sweater, I had short rows at the bottom of the front because that was a real bloused sort of effect. And so there were tons of extra stitches that created sort of horizontal blousing. And then there were all these short rows in the front that created extra length right up the center. And then there was a ton of decreases right after that before starting the ribbing, in order to bring the ribbing, to eliminate all that blousing so that the ribbing would be snug. So in the Edwardian sweater, the short rows use the most basic method of short rowing there is, which is you work up to a certain point and then you just turn and you work in the opposite direction. This new sweater, you knit up to wherever you want to turn, you turn and you slip the first stitch. So that's the sort of most basic short row technique that you can apply at a short row turn, because the problem with just turning and then knitting back in the other direction is that you get a hole. But the bigger problem, especially in stockinette fabric, is that you will get a selvage stitch. So you have two rows sitting on top of each other and they're producing an edge, and stockinette always has that stitch that looks like a regular stitch and then the one above it that's got the bump and the twist, because you're working it to the end of a row and then you're working that same stitch again on the way back, so you get that twisted bump at the edge. And in short rows, that's going to happen if you don't apply some sort of technique at that turning point. And there's tons of techniques, but turning and slipping is the easiest one. So that was really interesting that there was short row shaping in the shoulders. They weren't using the stair step bind off, which some of the patterns would have done at that time. When I've seen the separate back knit that had shoulder shaping, sometimes it was bind offs, and very occasionally it was short rows. So that was delighting me. The other thing I was really interested in was the shawl collar, because I really like my neck to stay warm, and the shawl collar appeals to me. But the shawl collar sweaters I have knit in the past few years have are either skimpy shawl parts, or in the case of the sweater I knit last fall, the neck opening is so wide that the shawl collar just kind of is sort of more decorative. It's not really as functional as I would like. And I noticed in those early sweaters, which I normally only see this in men's sweaters with the shawl collar, but what I noticed was that they were much closer around the neck and they came up higher, and they were exactly the kind of shawl collar that I wanted. So that was another reason this sweater appealed to me, is it had a shawl collar, and I wanted to learn how that was constructed. The next thing that I looked at was the sleeve construction, and it started at the top and it was worked down. It was different than the Edwardian sweater. The Edwardian sweater started with the 3 inches or so that was the top of the sleeve cap, and then it would cast on 2 stitches at the beginning of every row, so the cap get gradually wider and wider. And so it was a very wide and quite shallow cap. And so I was looking at this one and I was charting it out, because that's what I do whenever I'm going to start a new project, because it's like pre-knitting. I kind of see where it's going, I see where shaping is, and do I want to make any modifications. And so I wanted to see where this thing was going. And one of the things I'd noticed is that the armhole shaping for the front of the sweater was not the same as for the back. So that's interesting to me. And that of the whole circumference, 40% of the stitches are on the back, 60% are on the front. It's not divided evenly the way we do now. That's another interesting thing to me. But the sleeve cap, it wasn't starting with the top of the cap and then casting on a few stitches. This one cast on all of the stitches for the whole sleeve cap width, and then again short row shaping to form the cap. So these elements, all of these elements, really makes me want to knit this sweater. So I had charted one of the fronts. The instructions for the other front was just to reverse what I'd done the first time, so I didn't bother charting it. I charted the front, charted the back. I charted the sleeve cap. I hadn't bothered charting all of the decreases, and that wasn't that interesting to me. I wanted to get on with seeing how the collar was shaped. And I looked and I couldn't find the instructions for the collar anywhere. And I thought, well, maybe I'd missed something in the instructions for the front, because the way a shawl collar is formed is that it's a V-neck, and that V-neck gets filled in basically with the collar so that you have a straight line. The two fronts would actually continue to go straight up, except instead the collar folds back. And sometimes this is formed by adding the shawl collar later, and sometimes it's formed by knitting it at the same time that you're doing the decreases to form the V-neck. Then you'd just be working more and more stitches for the shawl collar. So I thought, well, did I miss something? It didn't seem like I could have, since I charted it out. And no, I hadn't missed anything. And I could see in the finishing instructions, they were referring to the collar and centering it, have the right side of the back facing you while you center the collar and then sew it in, neatly. And I couldn't find it. So I thought, geez, I wonder if this has to do with the fact that it was on Project Gutenberg. Like maybe they had scanned the page, and when they did the OCR, somehow they skipped that part of it, and those instructions for the collar somehow got left out. So I went on to Ravelry's, a group on Ravelry called, I think it's Vintage Knitters or Vintage Knitting or All Things Vintage, something like that. And I went on there and I asked if anybody had a copy of that pattern book so that I could find out if the instructions were just missing from Project Gutenberg or if they're missing from the booklet altogether. Because if they're missing from the booklet altogether, it doesn't do me anything to try to bid on that book in the auction anyway, which by that point I'd kind of thought maybe I probably wasn't going to bother with. But
if the problem is Project Gutenberg and the instructions really are in the booklet, then that would really make me want to have the copy of that book. So a couple of people did say that they had that book, and one of them scanned that page that where the pattern was so I could read through it. And I looked at it, and I was reading the instructions. Okay, here's the sleeve instructions. Okay, here's the instructions for where you change to a smaller needle at the cuff. I hadn't gotten that far in the sleeve instructions because I, had done the cap and that was all I cared about. So there were all these instructions for switch to a smaller needle, and then all these decreases to reduce the stitch count because it's more of a bloused sleeve, and so they want to make the cuff tight. So it's got that line of instructions, and then the next line of instructions was repeat last 3 rows until 2 stitches remain, bind off. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense in the context of the cuff. And then I looked at it again, and I realized not only are the instructions for the collar missing, but the instructions for the cuff are missing. So I have the first line of instructions for the cuff, and that next line of instructions is the last line of instructions for the collar. So like, oh crap, now what am I going to do? Because I wanted to knit this so I could learn how this shawl collar was constructed. But I decided I had enough information about how the neckline was actually formed that I could probably reverse engineer from that last line of instructions and figure out a shawl collar that would at least work. So I got out my copy of Designing Knitwear. It's by Deborah Newton. I looked at it last fall when I got frustrated with the shawl collar sweater that I had knit to see what makes a good shawl collar. And I'd found a page in that book that really kind of showed the dimensions and proportions and shapes of different types of shawl collars and what they looked like and on different types of necklines. And so I looked at that and I thought, there's one of the shapes in there I'm pretty sure is what this sweater should have had. There are a couple of things that I might have to experiment with to see how well they work, but I have a pretty good idea of how that shawl collar is going to work. And this is really something I'm looking for in these vintage patterns. What gets left out, either because it's assumed or because they just left it out, the typesetter left it out. So this is the thing that's going to be exciting for me to figure out. So I am still going to knit this sweater. And then I found out that the auction, which ends in June 15th, is actually open. So I thought, well, I'm going to just go check out, because I knew there was no reserve. Like it would take whatever the minimum bid anybody gave, they would take for those sweater patterns. But I wasn't confident that it was going to be something I would want to pursue. So I went on the other day, and the bidding was already at $80 Canadian, and now it's up to 100, which is 75 US. And I'm like, there's no way. Because not only is this a book available on Project Gutenberg, it's also available as hard copy reproductions. They're available all over. I mean, you can go on Amazon if you want and get a hard copy reproduction of that book. I'm curious to see what that bundle of 3 patterns is going to go for. And I saw those prices and I thought, well, I don't actually know if that's unreasonable. It seems like a lot of money, but it is 3 patterns. And it's from this woman's house. So if you really wanted something from that woman's house, if you had that meaning associated with it, and that's why you wanted it. But I really didn't know. So I went back onto the vintage group and I said, what is sort of the average price of these vintage patterns that were like from 1900 to 1950? And they said, it really depends. It could be anywhere from $3.50 up to $100. It depends on the rarity of it, the perceived rarity of it. And then this woman said, or if there's a bun fight over it, which was a new expression for me. I'd never heard of that. And I had to think about what could that mean? And I realized she was British, and she meant like tea buns. So like who's like fighting over the last bun. And I thought, well, I'm not getting in that bun fight, but I'm going to watch it. So in the meantime, I'm going to be well on my way through this sweater by the time that auction is over. So I don't need it, but it was kind of an interesting thing to work through and figure out and then hunt down. So I'm going to answer some questions now. One person wanted to know what my favorite sources were for Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns. And I do have two sources that I use, and I really think they're probably the most commonly used sources and the most abundant in terms of the number of stitch patterns that are in there. So if you don't know, Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns are like mini cables in a way. They're like mini traveling cables. So if you think of the kind of cables that have multiple sort of strands of two knit stitches that kind of travel across the background of pearls and intertwine with each other, those are traveling cables. So Bavarian or Austrian traveling twisted stitch patterns are like that, only instead of ropes of two stitches that are traveling across, it's little ropes of single stitches that are knit through the back loop. And they're often knit on at fine gauges, and they're very intricate. Originally, traditionally knit in men's stockings starting in, I think, the 17th century. So in this alpine region of mostly Austria, I think, but it's also in Bavaria and parts of Switzerland, I think. So in this alpine area where the language is this, they call it Austro-Bavarian language. It's this area. So originally they were on men's stockings, and which would have been cream color wool, and these are men who would have been wearing pants, trousers, like lederhosen, so like leather shorts, or down to their knee maybe. So these are stockings that would go all the way up to their calves, up to their knees, and that was part of their national costume. It was like peasant costume. Then gradually they were adopted into women's stockings as well, but the women's stockings were white cotton, and they were held up with a little garter that would have, or a ribbon or something that would have been threaded through casing at the top of the stocking. And in the case of women's, like men's stockings would have had a gusset, so at the calf gusset, and it would have been this insert that would have been kind of oblong shaped, and that would have also had intricate stitch patterning inside of there. And the women's stockings did not have gussets, and they were knit with cotton, and they often had lace patterning as well as these traveling twisted stitch patterns. So I got very interested in them because I love cables. Well, as soon as I found out about them, I loved them. So here's some examples, like, see if you can see these. Or maybe I'll put some photos up instead, but I have some different mitts that I have designed using Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns. And then I have patterning on the palms as well on these. The original one doesn't have any patterning, just the textured filler stitch pattern. And then these two have patterns on the palm. So what happened with these stitch patterns are not possible, as far as I know, that you can't do them on a knitting machine because of the twisted stitches. Just like crochet can't be done on a machine, not real crochet. So as people weren't having to wear sort of their traditional folk costumes, it wasn't a requirement. I mean, there used to be people had to wear certain kinds of dress. They weren't allowed to wear other kinds of dress. They had to wear things that identified what their social status was. And as that changed, these patterns kind of shifted over into waistcoats, like buttoned up waistcoats or cardigans, and they kind of transferred to those. But in the world of, machine knit, commercial knitwear, these aren't things that you can replicate. Not like an Aran sweater can be done by machine. So cables can be done by machine. And when you look at these traditional stockings, when people are going to festivals and stuff and they're wearing the traditional costume, and they buy stockings for that purpose, a lot of times they'll just be some kind of simple knit purl pattern type of thing that sort of suggests cables, or they will be cables. They won't be this. The only way you could get this is if you hand knit them. So these stitch patterns were really in danger of being lost. There were these museums all over the countryside that had samplers
that women had made. Those were their stitch dictionaries. When they'd find a new stitch pattern on somebody's stockings or something, they would borrow that sampler and study it, and then they would knit it into their own sampler so they would have a reference for it. So there are these bands of these stitch patterns in these different museums all over the place in that area of Europe. And then there would be examples of the stockings and things as well. But there are two women who are really concerned about these traditional stitch patterns dying out. And the first one was Maria Erlbacher. So she did two booklets in I think it was 1982 for this museum where they had these things on display. So it was in collaboration, I believe, with this museum. And it was the museum that sold these booklets. So they're called, this is the name of the book. So it's traditional patterns of the Enstal Valley. The first one came out in early 82, and then the second one came out in the fall of 82, and they were really popular. People really liked them, so they came out with a third booklet a few years later that was derived, the stitch patterns were all derived from one particular woman's collection of garments and samplers and things, from what I'm understanding. So Schoolhouse Press, which is here in Wisconsin, it was Elizabeth Zimmerman's company, and now her daughter Meg Swanson runs it. They distributed these booklets at one time, and inside the booklet were these little cards, because these are all charted patterns, and they use charts that are not like you're going to be used to. And so they would have a little card that would explain what all the different symbols meant in Bavarian German, so it's in that dialect. And then Schoolhouse Press would include this little sheet of paper that has the important information translated into English, because mostly what's in these booklets are charts, and you'd use the charts to create your own designs using the stitch patterns from there. Well, sometime in the past 5 or 10 years, these were out of print. They were no longer published. When I found out about them, I found out that that Schoolhouse Press didn't have anymore, but they were still available from the museum. And I was trying to figure out how to order them from there. I'd found out about it on Ravelry, and somebody said, "Oh, I have those booklets. I'll sell them to you." So I got them, and then I don't know, a year or two after that, Schoolhouse Press came out with an updated, translated version of these booklets. They're all in one volume, translated into English, and it's called Twisted Stitch Knitting, and you can still get that from Schoolhouse Press. So it has all of these stitch patterns in there, and I'll leave a link down below to what the name of the source is. So she put these together in 1982. There's another woman who, it sounded like she was at some kind of music festival in South Tyrol, which is in it's kind of a disputed area from what I understand of Europe. It's like they're independent, but it's sort of like Switzerland, Northern Italy, Austria area, I think. So she was going to these music festivals, and she was knitting her own stockings, and people were really interested in them. And so she's, wrote down the stitch patterns, and the next music festival where she encountered them, she was passing around. And then over the next few years, she started seeing more and more people showing up with actual stockings, because like I said, the only way you could get them would be if you hand knit them. So she got really obsessed with collecting these patterns the way Maria Erlbacher had, and she also did a lot more study of the history of these books. And they have a lot of the same stitch patterns in them, but Maria Erlbacher's books mostly have the stitch patterns that you would have seen on men's stockings. So it's not that you wouldn't have seen them on women's, but they don't have any of the lacy types of patterns. And Liesl Fandrol's books do. Now hers is also a 3-volume set, Barlisch Stricken, which is basically peasant knitting or farmer knitting, or peasants are farm workers or farmers, and because these are the traditional patterns that those people would have worn. So she has a lot more information in hers. Unfortunately, it's only in Bavarian German. So
it kills me sometimes to go, I'm like, I just wish I could read this. And so there was a few years ago when I was working on my master hand knitting program, I had to write a report on some traditional knitting styles. One of them was Aran knitting, and the other was these Bavarian stitches. And so I worked really hard at certain sections. I would retype it and put it into Google Translate and see if I could make sense of what a particular section was about and if I could get the gist of it. And there were some places that was really difficult for me. And so I asked a friend of mine who's a PhD and works translating German and Russian text of, business documents, all kinds of things like that, if she could help me with the sections I didn't quite understand. And she did. So as a thank you to her, when I was done with the Master Hand Knitting program and I had time to really start designing things for myself, one of the first things I wanted to design was a fingerless mitt pattern that would use these Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns. One of the things I learned in those early years of being able to self-publish designs using Ravelry was to really think about what I was going to call the pattern. Because remember how I said, oh, these old vintage patterns, it's lady sweater, lady sweater, lady sweater. Well, when I learned to knit, and the patterns I was looking at were usually within a particular magazine or within a particular book. You were only ever comparing patterns in a very small subset. And so a lot of times a booklet would just have things numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or there might be a minimal description. Like if it was, I have a book of children's sweaters up here and colorful sweaters. And so they have all the pictures in the front and then they have all the patterns in the back, and they identify them with farm yarn animals or cable, sweater. It was a little bit of description, but nothing really unique. And because it didn't have to be, because you were just looking at things within this booklet. So when I first started designing and publishing patterns on Ravelry, my first pattern was, my big decision was, do I call it reversible cabled scarf or reversibly cabled scarf? That was what my thinking was. And then my next pattern, which was for my beginning knitting students, easy fingerless mitts. And then my third one was sideways cabled hat. So I was just describing what they were, and it seemed like it made total sense. And it wasn't a bad idea at the beginning because there weren't hundreds of thousands of patterns. But now there are probably 20 patterns called easy fingerless mitts. And so that wasn't such a great idea. And I became aware of that when I started designing these mitt patterns. And I was thinking about submitting to Knitty. I can remember the first pattern I knit from Knitty back in like 2005 or 6. It was a sock pattern, and it was by Cookie A, and it was called Pomadomus. I remember it, and a lot of people loved that stitch pattern, and then they would use that stitch pattern on other things like hats and scarves and mittens or whatever, and they would always call it Pomadomus this or Pomadomus that. And so that got to be very identifiable. It made sense to have a name that was unique for something, so that when somebody was looking for it or trying to remember or find it on Ravelry, that there wouldn't be dozens and dozens of them. So when I designed this mitt pattern, I thought, what am I going to call this? Well, what I had done was I had translated Bavarian stockings into a fingerless mitt, and I'd gotten a lot of help about the history of these stitch patterns from my friend who had translated them for me. So that mitt pattern I called Translated, and from then on I had to really think about what I was going to call things. And so, which one is this? This one I called Palm Tulips. Central design right here has a tulip design on it, and then I put a little tulip on the palm as well. And then this one, there's this like kind of helix pattern on the side, and so I called this one Deep Freeze Helix or something. I don't even know why I called it that, but I tried to give them names that would be unique and could be remembered, because That was the thing. The thing about Liesl Fandrel's books, I think it's the first one or the second one, is that she has in the second, they come as a set of 3. I don't think you can buy them separately. But there are these patterns in here, and they're for stockings, and they're not for the whole stocking, they're for parts of the stocking. So remember I said that the men's stockings had these gussets, calf gussets? Well, those are a lot harder to just represent with a little chart this big in a book because they have all of this shaping and the pattern grows into it and then it shrinks. And so she has all of these charted patterns for calf gussets. And so there's different stockings in the books, and they'll refer to these particular pages if they're on there. So that's kind of interesting. Now, she has a charting method that uses different symbols than Maria Erlbacher's. But they function similarly. And again, it's not the same way you think of charts nowadays. So for me, because I chart everything again anyway, and because usually with these stitch patterns, you're using one from this book on this page and that one from another book on a different page, and you're combining them together, you need to rechart them anyway. And so what I tend to do is rechart these patterns using my charting software in a way that makes it easier for me to just automatically interpret them by looking at them. Because I can read these charts, I just have to think a lot harder. I have to, it's just a different thing. It's, I don't have the muscle memory for it. And because I'm recharting anyway, there's no way for me to rechart them like they are in this book. So I just don't bother. So I answer one more question. I never know how long it's going to take me to answer these questions. So I'm never sure how many I can do. Somebody was asking me, what is the best way to support me if they wanted to do that? Would it be supporting me by buying me a coffee on Ko-fi.com, or would it be by buying my patterns? And the answer to that is both of those support me sort of financially in the same way, because the payments come to me right from PayPal. Ko-fi doesn't take anything off the top. Ravelry doesn't take anything off the top unless I hit a certain threshold of selling a certain number of patterns per month. And then if I'm selling that many patterns, I'm happy to give them a very tiny percentage. PayPal is the only one that really takes any fees out, and they take them out of both of those. So it helps me in both to support me on Ko-fi or to buy my patterns. The thing that helps the most is if you buy a pattern and then knit it and put it in your Ravelry project page and with a photo. That's going to help me the most, because then people looking at my patterns will see that other people have actually knit them and how they turned out and that kind of thing. So leaving writing comments or writing notes in a project page, and that's the thing that's going to help me the most, but it may not be the thing that works for you because you may not be interested in knitting one of my particular patterns. So that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask me for a future Casual Friday, please leave those down in the comments below, or you can leave them in my Ravelry group, Rocks, and there are links down in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.